mean I'll see it.
My grandmother always had this thing for treasures. That's what she called them anyway. To anyone else, her house was just a graveyard for Victorian junk and porcelain dolls that looked like they were judging your every life choice. When I moved into my first apartment, she showed up with a box wrapped in faded yellow newspaper. Inside was Ellen. Ellen was a vintage porcelain doll, maybe 16 inches tall, wearing a lace dress that had turned the color of a smoker's teeth over the decades. Her face was that classic, deathly pale white, with rosebud lips and glass eyes that seemed way too reflective. But it was the hair that stood out. It wasn't that cheap synthetic stuff you see on modern toys. It was thick, chestnut brown, and felt unnervingly like actual human protein. My grandmother leaned in close when she handed her to me and whispered that Ellen's special characteristic was her hair. I just figured she meant it was expensive or something. I didn't want the thing in my bedroom, so I put her on the highest shelf in the dining room, tucked between some old cookbooks and a wooden fruit bowl. From up there, her gaze was angled downward, right at the spot where I usually sat to eat. I tried to ignore her, but every time I walked past, I felt those glass eyes tracking the movement of my neck. About a week after Ellen arrived, things started feeling off in the apartment. It wasn't a sudden shift, just a slow, grinding realization that the privacy I thought I had was gone. The air felt thick, like walking through waist-deep water every time I crossed the living room. Then, the bedroom door started acting up. I'm a light sleeper and a bit of a stickler for security, so I always make sure the latch clicks before I go to bed. But for 3 nights in a row, I woke up to find the door standing open about 4 inches. No draft could have done it. The latch was sturdy. By the 4th night, the creeping dread was enough to make me buy one of those cheap motion-activated security cameras. I set it up on the dresser facing the door and went to sleep, feeling a little bit like a paranoid idiot. I woke up the next morning to a silent house. The bedroom door was wide open again. I pulled up the footage on my phone, my heart doing this weird, fluttering thud against my ribs. The video started at 2:48 a.m. For the first few seconds, it was just the grainy black and white view of my dark room. Then, a dull, heavy thump echoed through the speakers. It sounded like a bag of flour hitting the hardwood floor out in the hallway. A few moments later, something moved into the frame. It wasn't a person. It was Ellen. She didn't walk. Her ceramic legs were fused in a sitting position, so she couldn't. Instead, she moved with this rigid, hitching motion, her body jerking across the floor as if she were being yanked by invisible wires. But then I saw what was actually moving her. The chestnut hair, which used to stop at her shoulders, was now several feet long. It wasn't just hanging there, it was alive. The strands were thick and ropey, twisting together like a cluster of earthworms. The hair reached out, the ends of it gripping the door frame like tiny, desperate fingers, pulling her porcelain weight upward and forward. I watched the screen, bile rising in my throat, as the doll used her hair to scale the side of my nightstand. The strands of hair wound around the lamp base and my alarm clock, hoisting her body up until her face was level with mine while I slept. She didn't do anything to me. Not that night. She just sat there, her hair undulating and pulsing like a mass of dark veins, while she spent the next 3 hours methodically rearranging the things on my nightstand. She moved my glasses, my water glass, and my phone, sliding them back and forth with those sickening tresses of hair. And the whole time, her frozen, painted face was turned away from me, staring directly into the camera lens with those wide, reflective eyes. I didn't go to work that day. I grabbed a kitchen trash bag, shoved Ellen inside, and drove to a dumpster 3 miles away. I watched the bag sink into the pile of rotting garbage and drove home, shaking so hard I could barely steer. I spent the evening scrubbing the apartment, trying to get rid of the smell that had started to permeate the dining room. It wasn't a chemical smell. It was an organic, wet scent, like a butcher shop that had been left in the sun, mixed with the saltiness of sweat. I thought it was over. I really did. That night, I barricaded the bedroom door with a heavy chair. I fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming of long, brown fibers sliding down my throat. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something wet dragging across the floorboards. Scrape. Slither. Scrape. I reached for the lamp, but my hand hit something cold and smooth. My fingers brushed against a surface that felt like polished bone. I froze. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I clicked the lamp on. Ellen was sitting on my pillow, barely 3 inches from my face. She was covered in filth from the dumpster, streaks of gray slime and coffee grounds smeared across her lace dress. But it was her hair that made me scream. It had grown even more. It was everywhere. It filled the bed like a nest of thick, brown cobwebs. It was coiled around my ankles, cinched tight enough to bruise the skin. It was draped over the headboard, and thousands of individual strands were rooted into the mattress, stitching the doll to the bed. The smell was overpowering now. It was the scent of raw, open meat, iron-rich and pungent, like a fresh wound that hadn't begun to scab over. I tried to jump out of bed, but the hair around my ankles snapped taut. I looked down and saw the hair wasn't just wrapped around my legs, the ends of the strands were actually burrowing. They were pushing under my skin, threading themselves into my pores like needles. I grabbed a pair of embroidery scissors from the nightstand drawer and began hacking at the hair. It didn't feel like cutting thread. It felt like cutting through gristle and tendon. Every time the blade snipped a lock of hair, a thick, dark fluid, too dark to be water, too red to be oil, leaked out of the severed ends. The doll's face never changed, but as I cut, a high-pitched, rhythmic clicking started coming from inside her porcelain head. I managed to free one leg, the skin weeping a thin, pinkish discharge where the hair had been rooted. I didn't stop to grab anything. I ran out of the apartment in my underwear, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement of the hallway. I didn't look back until I was in my car, the engine screaming as I backed out of the parking spot. I stayed at a motel that night, and the next, and the one after that. I was too terrified to go back, but eventually I had to. I called a friend to come with me. We entered the apartment with a crowbar and a gallon of bleach. The bedroom was empty. The bed was stripped down to the springs. There was no sign of the doll, no sign of the lace dress. But when we pulled the mattress back, we saw it. The entire wooden frame of the bed was covered in tiny, microscopic holes, as if thousands of worms had tried to eat through the timber. And stuck in the cracks of the floorboards, scattered across the rug, and clogging the drain in the bathroom were clumps of thick, chestnut brown hair. I moved out that weekend. I left everything behind, my clothes, my furniture, my books. I didn't care. I just wanted to be away from that smell and that hitching, dragging sound. I'm in a new place now, 3 states away. I don't have any decorations. No shelves, no trinkets. But last night, I was brushing my own hair in front of the bathroom mirror. I felt a tug. Not a normal snag, but a sharp, aggressive pull from the back of my scalp. I reached back to feel for a knot, and my fingers closed around something hard. Buried deep against my skull, hidden under my own hair, I felt a small, smooth curve of cold porcelain. And when I pulled my hand away, there was a single, thick strand of chestnut brown hair tangled between my fingers, pulsing with a slow, steady heartbeat.
Next story.
Retail at night is a different kind of quiet. It's not the peaceful silence of a library or a park after dark. It's a pressurized, artificial stillness held together by the hum of the HVAC system and the dim, flickering glow of the emergency lights. I work the graveyard shift at a high-end department store downtown, one of those places where the carpets are thick enough to swallow your footsteps and the marble pillars look like they belong in a mausoleum. My job was simple: restocking, basic maintenance, and making sure the floor looked boutique ready for the morning rush. Old Arthur was the head janitor, a man who had been at that store since the day it opened 30 years ago. He was a quiet guy, mostly kept to himself, but he had this weird habit of nodding to the mannequins as he buffed the floors. One night, while I was unboxing a shipment of designer coats, he stopped his machine and leaned on the handle, looking me dead in the eye. He pointed a calloused finger toward a group of figures dressed in evening wear and told me, "Boy, you need to treat the people here with respect." I remember laughing. I thought it was just the late shift dementia setting in. I told him they were just plastic and fiberglass, but he didn't smile back. He just went back to his buffing, leaving a trail of shiny floor and a weirdly sour feeling in my gut. Then there was Taylor. Taylor was the kind of guy who thought everything was a joke and everyone was beneath him. He was a seasonal hire, mostly there to move the heavier displays, and he hated the mannequins. He said they gave him the creeps, but instead of just ignoring them, he decided to be a bully about it. He'd knock their wigs off, draw on their faces with erasable markers, or pose them in suggestive, degrading ways. One Thursday night, we were moving the new spring collection into the main atrium. There was this one mannequin number 1, we called it, that stood right at the top of the escalator. It was taller than the others, with a more realistic, matte finish and eyes that seemed to have a bit too much depth. Taylor was frustrated because the silk dress he was trying to pull over its torso kept snagging. He let out a string of curses, grabbed the mannequin's plastic chest with both hands, and shook it violently. He started making these crude, aggressive jokes, mocking the way the plastic felt under his hands. I told him to knock it off, mostly because I didn't want to get written up for damaged property, but he just laughed and shoved the figure so hard it nearly tipped over. About an hour later, I was up in the security office taking my break. The head of security was downstairs grabbing coffee, so I was just watching the wall of monitors. The feed for the main atrium was grainy, washed out in that sickly green night vision hue. I saw Taylor walk past mannequin number 1 on his way to the loading dock. He didn't even look at it. But as soon as his back was turned, the second he moved out of its peripheral line of sight, the mannequin's arm moved. It wasn't a mechanical jerk. It wasn't a loose joint failing. It was a slow, deliberate, fluid motion. The mannequin raised its hand and brushed the exact spot on its chest where Taylor had grabbed it. It looked like someone brushing off a layer of filth, a gesture of pure, unadulterated disgust. Right as the hand moved, the monitor erupted in a violent burst of static. The screen went black for a heartbeat, and when the image returned, the mannequin was back in its original pose. But its head wasn't looking at the escalator anymore. It had tilted, just a fraction of an inch, toward the hallway where Taylor had disappeared. I felt a sudden, sharp chill crawl up my spine. My skin felt tight, like it was a size too small for my body. I told myself it was a glitch in the frame rate, or maybe the vibration of the HVAC system had caused a shift. I stayed in that booth for 20 minutes, staring at the screen, waiting for it to move again. It didn't. Eventually, I had to go back down. I needed to finish dressing the display. As I approached mannequin number 1, I felt a wave of nausea. The air around it felt different, thick, stagnant, and smelling faintly of something metallic and rotten, like raw meat left out in a hot car. I reached out to adjust the silk dress, and my hand brushed against the skin of the mannequin's neck. I jumped back so hard I nearly fell over a display rack. It wasn't cold. It wasn't the temperature of a climate-controlled room. It was feverishly warm. It felt like touching the side of a person with a high flu, a radiating, pulsing heat that seemed to hum beneath the matte finish. I stood there, gasping, looking at the blank, painted eyes. I could swear the pupils were larger than they had been an hour ago. I didn't see Taylor for the rest of the shift. I assumed he'd slipped out early or was hiding in the break room. When the sun started to come up and the morning manager arrived, I clocked out and practically ran to my car. I didn't sleep that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that slow, graceful hand movement on the security footage. When I went back in for my next shift, the store was eerily quiet. The atmosphere was suffocating, a stifling pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. I went straight to the security office. The night manager, a guy named Marcus, was white as a sheet. He didn't say a word, he just pointed at the screen. The footage was from 3 a.m. Taylor had been in the basement storage, a place where we kept the retired mannequins, the ones with broken limbs or outdated faces. In the video, Taylor is seen backed into a corner, surrounded by dozens of those lifeless, plastic figures. The lights in the basement are flickering, creating a strobe light effect. Every time the light cuts out and comes back on, the mannequins are closer. They weren't walking. They were just appearing in new positions. One was reaching out. Another was stooped low. In the final frame before the camera feed cut out entirely, Taylor was being pulled into the darkness of the rear storage racks. You could see his fingers digging into the concrete floor, leaving behind dark, wet streaks that looked black in the infrared light. The police were called, obviously. They searched the whole building. They found Taylor in the morning, stuffed inside one of the large shipping crates in the loading dock. But he wasn't just dead. He had been repurposed. I saw the crime scene photos later through a friend on the force. I wish I hadn't. They had stripped him. His skin had been coated in a thick, industrial-grade lacquer that had hardened into a translucent shell, giving him a shiny, doll-like appearance. His joints had been snapped and reset with metal pins and hinges, forced into a rigid, standing pose. But the worst part was the face. They had used some kind of heavy-duty putty to fill in his nostrils and ears, and his eyes. They had been removed and replaced with the glass spheres from a mannequin #1 model. His mouth had been sewn shut with thick, nylon fishing line, but the stitches were so tight they had pulled his lips into a wide, horrific permanent grin. The smell in that loading dock, the officer told me, was a sickening mix of chemical varnish and the sweet, cloying scent of internal decay that had nowhere to go. I quit that day. I didn't even go back for my final paycheck. I moved to a different city, took a job in a warehouse where there are no displays and no human-shaped things. But sometimes, when I'm walking through a mall or passing a storefront after hours, I'll catch a glimpse of a figure in the window. I'll see a tilt of a head or the slight curve of a plastic finger, and I'll remember the way that skin felt, the radiating heat of something that was never meant to be alive, but was hungry for the warmth of someone who was. The store stayed open, of course. They just replaced the staff and moved on. But a month ago, I saw a digital flyer for their new spring gala. In the background of the promotional photo, standing right at the top of the escalator, was a mannequin I recognized. It was wearing a high-end tuxedo. It was taller than the others, with a pose that looked just a little too fluid, a little too strained. And even through the low-resolution image, I could see the eyes. They weren't painted on. They were deep, glassy, and filled with a silent, frozen scream.
Next story.
The trail I usually took was a well-worn loop near the edge of the state park, but that afternoon I decided to push further past the rusted gate that marked the boundary of the old logging property. It was one of those humid, stagnant days where the air feels like a wet wool blanket pressed against your face, and the further I walked, the quieter the woods became. Usually, you hear the persistent drone of cicadas or the rustling of squirrels in the dry leaves, but as I crossed into a clearing filled with stunted, gray oak trees, the silence became absolute. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of stillness that makes your ears ring, like the world is holding its breath. I almost tripped over the first one. It was a pale, tapered object poking out from a pile of rotting mulch. At first glance, I thought it was a discarded glove or perhaps a piece of bleached driftwood, but when I nudged it with the toe of my boot, the dirt fell away to reveal a mannequin hand. It was elegant, with long, slender fingers and a chipped, ivory finish. There was no brand name, no serial number, just a jagged, hollow opening where it should have been attached to a wrist. It felt out of place, but I figured some teenagers had dragged it out here for a prank or a photo shoot. I kept moving, though the back of my neck started to prickle with a localized heat. 50 yards further, I found the second one. This hand was different. It wasn't lying on the ground, It was jammed into the fork of a low-hanging branch, the fingers curled as if it were trying to pull the tree down. There was a dark, crusty substance smeared across the palm, not paint, but something thicker and more organic that had dried into a deep, brownish-purple crust. It smelled like a butcher's shop that had lost its refrigeration, a cloying, metallic rot that seemed to stick to the back of my throat. The trees started to grow closer together, their branches interlacing to block out the sun, plunging the path into a sickly, jaundiced twilight. That's when I saw the oak. It was a massive, dying thing, its bark peeling away in long, cancerous strips. Hanging from a thick, sturdy limb was a full-sized mannequin. It wasn't just a store model, it had been modified. The head was tilted at an impossible, snapped angle, and it swung gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. Someone had drenched it in red liquid, so much of it that the white plastic was barely visible beneath the layers of congealed, sticky crimson. Both of its hands were missing, leaving jagged, hollow stumps that dripped a slow, rhythmic sludge onto the roots below. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. This wasn't a prank. The sheer amount of effort it took to haul a life-sized figure this deep into the brush, to hang it with such precision, felt like a ritual. I turned to leave, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but as I spun around, the forest had changed. I hadn't noticed them on the way in because they were so perfectly integrated into the shadows. Dozens of them. They were tucked behind trunks, peeking out from behind thickets of brambles, and perched on high limbs. Some were missing limbs, others had their faces melted into smooth, featureless masks of distorted resin. One was posed in a mid-sprint, its legs locked in a dynamic stride as if it were chasing something just out of sight. Another was crouched at the base of a pine tree, its head tilted upward, staring at me with empty, painted eyes. The scale of it was overwhelming. There must have been 50 of them, all silent, all watching. The most unsettling part was the clothing. They weren't naked. They were dressed in mismatched, filthy rags, children's coats, stained work shirts, and tattered dresses that looked like they had been pulled from a dumpster. I started to jog, then I started to sprint. Every time I glanced sideways, I'd catch the flash of a plastic limb or the dull sheen of a synthetic torso through the leaves. I felt a crushing sense of being hunted, a pressure in my chest that made every gasp for air feel like I was inhaling sand. The path seemed longer than it had been before, the trees warping and stretching in the fading light. I didn't look back. I knew if I looked back, I'd see one of them moving, not sliding or rolling, but twitching into a new position the moment I blinked. The smell followed me. That thick, iron-rich stench of a slaughterhouse stayed trapped in my nostrils, getting stronger the closer I got to the parking lot. When I finally burst through the tree line and saw the gravel lot, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I fumbled for my keys, my fingers trembling so violently I nearly dropped them twice. I jumped into my old sedan, slammed the door, and locked it in one fluid, panicked motion. I sat there for a second, my forehead pressed against the steering wheel, listening to the frantic thud of my pulse. I was safe. I was in my car. It was just a weird, twisted art installation in the woods. I shifted the car into reverse and glanced at the rearview mirror to check behind me. My heart stopped. There was something in the back seat. It was buckled into the middle seat, sitting perfectly upright. It was wearing my spare Carhartt jacket, the one I kept draped over the headrest for emergencies. The hood was pulled up, shadowing the face, but I could see the smooth, reflective curve of a plastic chin poking out from the collar. It was one of them. Somehow, in the 20 minutes I'd been gone, someone had opened my locked car, dressed a mannequin in my clothes, and belted it in like a passenger. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over me, a sensation of absolute vulnerability that felt like ice water in my veins. My first instinct was to jump out of the car and run, but my curiosity, that morbid, stupid human trait, overrode my survival reflex. I needed to know if it was just a doll. I needed to see its face. I reached back, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. I grabbed the edge of the hood to pull it back, my fingers brushing against the fabric of my own jacket. The interior of the car was silent, save for the ticking of the cooling engine. As my hand made contact, the plastic fingers of the mannequin suddenly twitched. Before I could scream, its hand shot up and clamped around my wrist. It wasn't the hollow, lightweight feel of fiberglass or resin. It was dense. It felt like a skeleton wrapped in a layer of sun-hardened rubber, a grip so powerful I felt the bones in my forearm groan under the pressure. The skin was cold, unnaturally cold, but beneath the surface, I could feel a faint, rhythmic throb, a slow, mechanical imitation of a heartbeat. The hood fell back. It didn't have a face. Not a real one. It was a chaotic mess of stitched-together prosthetic parts, eyes mismatched and sunken into deep, raw sockets. The red paint I had seen in the woods wasn't paint at all. It was fresh, viscous, and it began to seep through the sleeves of my jacket, staining the denim a dark, wet black. The smell hit me then, not just the metallic tang of blood, but the scent of old chemicals and formaldehyde, the smell of something that had been preserved long after it should have rotted away. The thing didn't make a sound. It just held me, its grip tightening until my fingers went numb and my vision began to swim. I looked into those dead, acrylic eyes and realized the mannequins in the woods weren't the art. They were the leftovers. They were the shells. I managed to jam my free hand into the door handle, falling out of the car and onto the gravel, my wrist popping as I wrenched it free from that inhuman grasp. I didn't look back. I ran toward the main road, flagging down a passing truck, screaming for help. The police went back there an hour later. They found my car exactly where I'd left it, engine still idling, the driver's side door wide open. My jacket was lying in the back seat, neatly folded on the cushion. There was no mannequin. There was no blood. But when they checked the woods, they found something that the lead officer refused to describe to me for weeks. Deep in that clearing, under the hanging oak, they found a series of shallow pits. They weren't filled with plastic parts. They were filled with people, hikers, campers, locals who had gone missing over the last decade, each one of them meticulously posed, their skin chemically treated to look like ivory, their joints fused with industrial resin. They were decorated with the mannequin parts one had seen, their real hands replaced with plastic ones, their faces smoothed over with layers of wax and paint to create the perfect, permanent silent witness. I still have the bruises on my wrist. They aren't fading. They're turning a dull, yellowish white, and the skin there is starting to feel hard, smooth, and cold to the touch. Every morning, I wake up and it's spread a little further up my arm. I can't feel the needle when I prick it. I just see the pale, clear fluid leak out where the blood used to be. I think it's looking for the rest of its parts.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.